The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the truth either. It just reflects what the world insists you are. A shape, a skin, a face they never tried to understand. You stand there, silent, watching your own eyes watch you back. It's not vanity, it's reconnaissance. You're trying to locate something beneath the surface, something that used to feel real, before the world named you something you never agreed to be. They called you a threat long before you understood why. You weren't dangerous, you were different, still, unreadable, and that terrified them. The mirror remembers how their stares curled around you like nooses, how their voices echoed with suspicion dressed as concern. You were too quiet to be harmless, too observant to be innocent, too aware to be manipulated, so they placed the label on your back like a blade. Monster, not because you were one, but because they hoped the word would wound you deep enough to fold. But you didn't fold. You learned, you watched, and you remembered. That mirror became your first battle, a silent negotiation between what they saw and what you refused to become. You stared at yourself long enough to see the layers peel, the fear, the confusion, the hunger to belong. All of it bled away until only clarity remained, the kind of clarity that comes after the last illusion dies. You weren't broken, you were evolving, and something ancient moved inside you. Not rage, not revenge, something colder, wiser, a knowing. You began to understand what they feared wasn't your flaws, it was your control, your refusal to react like prey, your silence when they pushed, your patience when they tried to provoke chaos. That kind of power doesn't scream, it doesn't demand recognition, it simply watches and waits. You became the reflection they couldn't unsee, a constant reminder that not everyone can be read, claimed, or caged. They wanted a monster they could fight, a villain they could parade, but you gave them nothing, and that terrified them more than any scream ever could. So now when you look in the mirror, you no longer search for answers. You already know who you are, not the mask they tried to force on you, not the myth they feared into existence. You are the edge that refuses to dull, the presence that bends to no narrative. You are the consequence they didn't prepare for. The mirror hasn't changed, but you have, and that's what makes it blink first now. You weren't born in the dark. The light rejected you first. You remember the way the air felt heavier in certain rooms, the way some smiles came with teeth too sharp. You were small but not blind. You noticed everything. The tension behind voices, the hidden meanings in glances, the way people said your name like it was a warning to themselves. They didn't hit you with fists, they hit you with silence, with absence, with a kind of cruelty that's deniable. You learned early that monsters don't hide under beds. They sit across from you at dinner. They wear wedding rings. They laugh too loud. And when they hurt you, they do it in ways that look like accident. There were no witnesses, only watchers, the ones who saw and turned away. You screamed once, maybe twice, but when no one came, you swallowed your voice like a secret. That was the first transformation, not into something dark, but into something precise, strategic. You learned that visibility was vulnerability, that being seen meant being targeted, so you made yourself small, quiet, not out of fear, but out of calculation. You weren't hiding, you were studying. Other children played, you observed, they trusted. You noted how trust was currency, spent recklessly, often stolen. You listened to stories and saw the holes in them while they dreamed of heroes. You traced the architecture of villains. You didn't become one, but you understood them, and that made you different. They said you were too serious, too quiet, too intense. They meant you see too much. You remember too clearly. You don't let them rewrite the past with soft words. That frightened them, because you were the kind of child who didn't need to be told what was real. You already knew, and nothing terrifies liars more than a witness with perfect recall. They thought you were broken, you were becoming, you weren't angry, You were awakening. There was no switch, just a slow, deliberate ignition, the kind that doesn't burn out. You began to walk differently, not with arrogance, but with an awareness they couldn't name, like a wolf that's learned the layout of the trap and now walks its perimeter instead of stepping inside. And somewhere in that solitude, something older noticed you, not a god, not a demon, something beyond naming. A watcher from the places humans forget to look. It didn't speak, but you felt it like gravity, like fate. It saw your silence and didn't mistake it for submission. It saw your scars and didn't pity them. It saw you, and for the first time you felt seen by something that didn't want to break you, only to see what you would become. You didn't grow up in the dark, you grew up through it. There were always eyes on you, weren't there? Long before you understood what they were, not the eyes of people. People rarely looked into you. They saw the outline of a body and built their fears around it. But these other eyes, they watched from beyond walls, behind thought, through time, quiet, unblinking, patient. They never interfered, never spoke, but they were there when you were hurting, when you were alone, when your innocence was being carved out of you. In slow, methodical slices, they saw it all, and they did nothing. You never roared, never needed to. While others wasted energy flaunting illusions of dominance, you watched, calculated, memorized every twitch in their lies, every crack in their armor. You learned that power didn't come from volume, it came from precision, the sharpness of silence, the ability to disappear into a room and still change the temperature. They laughed once, thought your quiet meant soft, mistook your stillness for surrender. They didn't realize you were studying the architecture of their minds, mapping out the fault lines they hoped no one would see. Pain had taught you one thing: visibility is vulnerability. So you became the echo instead of the voice, the question instead of the answer. You let them forget you were there until you weren't. You erased yourself from the noise, but not from the equation. Behind every decision, behind every collapse, your fingerprints were hidden beneath layers of deniability. You were never trying to be seen. You were preparing to see everything. You didn't fight like they expected. You didn't swing wildly into the dark. No, you made darkness your ally, not to hide in, but to command. You became the thing that moved between the seams of reality, the shadow cast before the light, the cold whisper that reached them before your steps did. Not a soldier, not a hero, a mechan, silent, surgical. You had become the thing that doesn't flinch, the presence that doesn't beg to be known, but demands to be felt. What broke you didn't destroy you, it sharpened you. It took your noise, your cries, your rage, and folded them into strategy. Every betrayal, every cruel word, every act of neglect, it all became code, and you deciphered it, not with vengeance but with clarity. You didn't become a weapon to lash out. You became one to balance the scales, because somewhere deep in you, below the layers they tried to rot, was an instinct older than memory. Protect what others would destroy, even if that meant destroying them first. And still you don't boast. You let them write their story, draw their lines, assign their meanings. But when things fracture, when the masks fall and chaos stirs, it's you they turn to. The silent weapon they forgot was watching. You've walked through fire and didn't carry the smoke with you. You didn't burn, you learned. And now when the monsters test the door, they don't just find it locked. They find your presence on the other side, waiting, still patient, not because you enjoy the confrontation, but because you were built to end it. They'll never understand how you move without sound, how you strike without being seen. They'll never admit how much they fear what you've become, but it doesn't matter. They don't need to call you anything at all, because by the time they realize you're not the victim, not the villain, not even the hero, it's already too late. You were never meant to be named, only remembered. They never feared what you were. They feared what they couldn't command. They tried to mold you, twist you into something manageable, palatable, the kind of creature they could invite into their circles, so long as you bowed your head and spoke with a soft, agreeable tone. But even as a child, there was something unshakable in you, something ancient, something they couldn't name. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't rage, it was refusal, silent, unmovable refusal that terrified them more than violence ever could. You weren't designed for obedience. While they clung to hierarchy and illusion, you were studying the space between words, learning the cracks in every mask they wore. They said you were too intense, too quiet, too observant, as if noticing too much was a crime, as if reading the room too deeply made you dangerous. And maybe it did, because you started seeing through them. You saw how they wore kindness like camouflage, how they used rules like chains, how they feared being seen for what they really were, fragile tyrants with painted smiles. They labeled you to disarm you, monster, not because you had done monstrous things, but because you wouldn't kneel, because you wouldn't perform weakness to soothe their illusion of control. You weren't cold, you were precise, you weren't cruel, you were unshakable. And for people whose power depends on chaos, calm is the ultimate threat. There's a certain clarity that comes when you stop needing their approval, a quiet liberation. They can't own what they can't understand, and you stop translating yourself for them. You became a different language entirely, one written in silent looks and invisible boundary. You made them uncomfortable, not because you crossed the line, but because you drew it and stood behind it, without apology, without permission. They will always fear the one who cannot be bribed by belonging, because you know things they wish you didn't. You know how easily authority shatters when challenged with stillness. You know how survival doesn't always scream. It often watches, waits. You've learned that power is not noise, not posture, not violence. It's the ability to remain unmoved when provoked. You weren't cast out because you were a monster. You were cast out because you couldn't be collared. Because when you walk into a room, they feel it. That unspoken calculation in you. That sense that you've seen the machinery behind the curtain. And you're not impressed. You are not aggressive.
You are inevitable.
And inevitability terrifies those who survive on illusion. So they called you names, projected their fears onto your skin, branded your silence as threat, your autonomy as evil. But deep down they knew you were not theirs to manage. You never were. They don't fear what you'll do. They fear that you exist at all. They see something in you they cannot name, and it terrifies them. Not because you're loud, not because you threaten, but because you don't need to. You walk into a room and the air changes. Laughter turns tight. Eyes flicker without reason. Because the monsters, those who wear smiles like masks, recognize something ancient in your silence, something they hoped had died off long ago. They've spent their lives feeding on fear, thriving in spaces where weakness bows and boundaries blur. But you don't flinch. You don't entertain their game. You watch and you wait. That's what unsettles them. Not your power, but your patience. The unshakable stillness behind your eyes. It tells them you've seen worse and survived it. And survival to monsters is rebellion, because it means their tactics failed, their illusion shattered, and now the prey looks at them without trembling. They remember the version of you that bled for their approval, the one that broke yourself into smaller pieces just to fit inside their fragile ego. That version made them feel godlike, powerful, in control. But you killed that version quietly, without ceremony, and what replaced it was something they don't understand because it cannot be manipulated. You became ungovernable, a mirror that reflects not who they pretend to be but what they truly are. And that's what haunts, not your strength, but what it reveals in. You don't strike first, you don't need to. Your presence alone calls their shadows to a. Your silence becomes interrogation, your gaze a confession booth. They say you're cold, detached, but what they really mean is you don't respond the way their victims usually do. You don't spiral, you calculate, and that makes you dangerous in a way they can't control or contain. Because monsters survive on patterns, predictable reaction, fragile egos that crack under pressure. But you broke the pattern, you rewired the equation, you became the variable they can't predict. Not soft, not cruel, strategic, and strategies, unlike emotions, don't beg for mercy, they execute. They know this, they feel it in your stillness, that any move you make is deliberate, that if you ever choose to become what they call you, it won't be chaos. It will be correction, precise, final. So they mock you, distance themselves, paint you as unstable, because they need to believe you're the threat. It distracts from what they see in your eyes. The reckoning they know is coming, not from rage, but from someone who once begged for peace and now builds their own kingdom in silence. That's what monsters see in you, not a threat to their lives, a threat to their lies. They never feared what you did, they feared what you could do, and so they named you Monster. Not because you tore things apart, but because you didn't, because you stood in the ruins they created, calm, unmoved, unbroken, watching, because deep down they knew you saw the lies behind their kindness, the fangs behind their smile. You didn't play along, you didn't fold, you became the quiet thing that didn't kneel, and that terrified them. It wasn't your rage that disturbed them, it was your restraint. The silence in your voice when you could have screamed, the way you walked through storms like they were background noise, the way you let them swing first, knowing they'd never land a second. You were method, not madness. You didn't burn bridges, you erased maps. They looked at you and saw something they couldn't tame. And in their world, untamed means untrusted. You were the one they whispered about behind locked doors, the one they tried to isolate because your presence made their masks itch. You didn't flinch when they threatened. You didn't beg when they withheld. You didn't crack when they tried to break you down piece by piece. Every scar they tried to inflict only became another line in the language you were writing, a language written in silence, discipline, and defiance. They called you a monster because it was easier than admitting you were the mirror. You reflected them back to themselves, and they couldn't bear the sight. You didn't follow the path, you walked beside it, eyes forward, pace steady, untouched by their chaos. They told stories to each other about how dangerous you were, hoping to convince themselves that you were the problem. But the truth always seeped through their stories like blood through linen. You weren't the monster, you were the warning, the ancient kind, the kind they used to whisper about in folklore and war chant, the thing sent not to destroy, but to remind the destroyers that the reckoning watches, that there is always a consequence. You became the balance they thought would never return. You didn't rise from darkness, you were forged in it. Every betrayal sharpened, every silence taught you. You became less of a person and more of a present. You don't threaten, you don't shout, you don't need to. Your existence is a message carved in shadow, this far, no further, and they feel it in the way the air shifts when you enter a room, in the stillness that wraps around you like armor, in the way they avoid your gaze because they know it sees too much. You were never built to be their weapon. You became your own fortress, not out of hate, not out of pride, but because someone had to stand between the monsters and everyone else. And when they sleep at night, if they sleep at all, it is not their guilt that keeps them awake. It is you.